I'm Jeff Kurkjian, and this is Do What You Love, where I take moments with some amazingly talented and smart people who do what they love every single day. And this is what I love to do, is talk with people. So I get a chance today to talk to my dad, Tim Kurkjian, on with us from Bristol, Connecticut, in kind of a quarantine-esque situation there. You had to take a COVID test before going to the ESPN campus. The 2021 baseball season has begun, and you are in Bristol, Connecticut. How does it feel to finally be back in a situation where you're with your teammates?
Well, Jeff, it is so much better to speak face to face to another human being. I was locked at our house, your house at home, trying to do television for about 6 months. And it all worked out, but it was difficult when you're sitting there by yourself trying to understand the technology. But this year, I'm going to be coming to Bristol all the time. I'm going to be sitting 6 feet away from our play-by-play guy, Carl Ravitch, 6 feet from Eduardo Perez, our other analyst, two of my best friends. And I can't wait to finish a full season actually speaking to other human beings, because that's what I think we've all missed the most, Jeff, is human interaction through this COVID.
Well, with that being said, you go back to the games you did last year for the 2020 baseball season, and you and many others were doing these games from home. I even saw in college basketball, NBA, football, these guys are calling the games from bedrooms, spare rooms, basements, offices. That experience was not something easy, and I have to commend you. Obviously, I'm biased, but I have to commend you for all of the years you've been in television, and you're one of those people making those adjustments. How difficult was it to convert your home into a space that was able to carry all of this?
Well, we had to get all new technology, Jeff. And sadly, you know about me and technology. For our listeners, every time Jeff comes home, the first thing he says is, Dad, you need any help with your phone or your computer? Because I always need help. And then they brought in all this new stuff, and we all had to learn the new technology. I'm telling you, Jeff, no sympathy required. But there were a couple times I was sitting at home alone trying to figure this stuff out. And I almost started to cry twice because I realized I'm completely overmatched here with this stuff. And then the first night, the first game of the year, it was on the West Coast. It was the Giants and the Dodgers, and we had this ridiculous delay, and we had an internet problem in our house. So I didn't even think I was going to be able to go on until about 15 minutes before the game started. And then with the delay and the play-by-play guy 400 miles away and the other analyst 1,000 miles away and the game 3,000 miles away, I ran into Eduardo like 20 times during the show because I wasn't sure whose turn it was to talk. It was only a question whether it was a block or a charge, but I think I had 6 charge violations in one game. But we got through it.
Yeah.
And the best part was nobody was listening to the broadcasters. All they wanted to do was watch a major league game. And eventually we figured this out. And I'm just so thrilled. I'll do it from home. That's good, but it's much better to do it from a studio. And of course, it's way better to do it from an actual ballpark.
Well, I must say, for all of the work you guys put in order to get the show where it was, they always say, given the certain circumstances, it looked great, but it really did look great. And speaking from experience, I had COVID-19 and had to do the show from a closet right over there, actually, before I had this beautiful setup. And it was the most difficult thing in the world because you can't pass the ball. You can't hand it off to your teammate. My co-host Amy here in Las Vegas, I couldn't give her the ball or do anything or tell a story. Everything was delayed because we were FaceTiming each other.
Yeah, it's terrible. And Jeff, you know that, body language and facial features and all that tells you so much. And that's what we missed so much, but we got pretty darn good at it. In fact, we did a game this spring from home, and a buddy of mine called me after the game and said, God, you guys were great. You had a great time. He said, when are you coming home from Florida? And I said, it wasn't in Florida. I did the game from Darnstown, Maryland. But he didn't even know. And that's, I guess, means we're starting to figure out how to do this
Right.
without being at the ballpark. But to repeat, Jeff, there is no substitute for being at the ballpark. And this is fine, but it's 1,000 times better when you're at Yankee Stadium.
Absolutely. And I know you've answered these questions 1,000 times, so I kind of want to move away from COVID, away from quarantine. I'm tired of unprecedented times and all of the things we say in order to make this sound like it's somewhat normal. So let's talk about the 2021 baseball season. This is another year of you covering baseball, and what year are we at? 44 this year of officially covering it in this capacity?
It's more like 42, but that includes some minor leagues and some stuff like that. But we'll just say 42 and leave it there. That's a pretty good run, by the way.
So the podcast is called Do What You Love, and the reason why it's called that is I like to talk to passionate people about what they're most passionate about. And you took what, using your words here, the only thing you know anything about, baseball, and made your passion into a very, very successful career. But I know firsthand that a lot of people have come to you and said, I want to be the next Tim Kurkjian. But for you, the TV thing was a late development in your career. And so for you, when you were 20, 18, 19, what did you see your career trajectory as? Did you ever imagine you'd be where you are right now?
No, when I was 18 years old, I just wanted to own a TV, let alone be on TV. When I was 18, I was in college and I had decided, since I have very few interests and very few skills, that if I can't play in the big leagues or play in the NBA, which simply wasn't happening after high school, I had to stay in it somehow. And I just decided I'm going to be a baseball writer. And I thought about that all along. I wrote for the school newspaper in high school. As you know, I went to Walter Johnson High School, named after the greatest pitcher of all time. There was some destiny involved there, Jeff. When you go to a high school named after the greatest pitcher ever, maybe you want to try to make a career in baseball. I worked for the school paper. It was called The Pitch. I did some work for the yearbook. It was called The Wind Up. I played baseball and basketball there. So I always felt like this is something I was meant to do, but I had to learn how to write first because I was a terrible writer in high school. I finally figured it out. I remember one story I wrote in high school. One of my gym teachers told me, Tim, that might be the worst story I've ever read in the school paper. He said, I hope you're not planning on making this your life's work. And here it is, 50 years later. I did. I made my life's work out of this because I learned eventually how to write, and then learning how to write eventually taught me how to do radio, how to do television. So for all you young people out there, you better learn how to write first because that's going to be critical in virtually anything that you do, whatever line you're in.
So we take some time during the Do What You Love podcast to ask you some questions, not only about what you love, but about maybe some missed opportunities. So, and not saying that you have missed any opportunity in your life, but is there one thing you always wanted to do despite having zero qualifications of doing that? And this cannot be related to sports or baseball in any way. Is there anything you've had that sparked an interest? Like, I've always thought that space travel was fantastic, but I couldn't even spell physics, yet alone execute physics in order to get a rocket in the sky. So for you, is there anything that you're unqualified to do, but you're fascinated with and would love to be able to do?
Well, I'm unqualified to do just about everything, Jeff. I mean, this is the truth of the matter. I know how to do TV now, and I know about baseball, and I know how to write. But my interest level on other things, non-sports, not particularly good. And I urge all young people, be more worldly than I am. Find something else that you like. To answer your question, Jeff, there's some places I would like to go. I would like to go to Australia. Of course, you've already been to Australia, and I'm 37 years older than you. I would like to go to Italy someday and just eat some great food, and travel around that place. Of course, I've never been there. Kelly and Mom, your sister and your mother, of course, they've been there. So I think eventually I would like to travel. The only thing I have going for me, Jeff, is I've covered a major league game in 62 ballparks. Okay,
Wow.
that's my claim to fame. Okay, and for what I do, I'll take it. Someday I'll get to go to Australia, but first I have to cover a game at the Great American Ballpark in Cincinnati. I mean, that those are my priorities as I continue to work here.
62 ballparks. I gotta ask, which one was the biggest surprise? We can go through and say, oh, Wrigley Field is the greatest park, Fenway Park, old Yankee Stadium, whatever. But which one would you say is the most underrated and the biggest surprise of a park that people should go see?
Well, if you haven't been to PNC Park in Pittsburgh, you got to go. I was told what a great park it was, and they understated it. That's how great it is. And when you go cover a game in Pittsburgh, you stay on the other side of the river and you walk over the Roberto Clemente Bridge, which delivers you right into PNC Park. And I don't want to be corny about this, Jeff, but Roberto Clemente died when I was 14 years old. I'll never forget that day. And to walk over that bridge and walk into that gorgeous ballpark, and that press box is way up in the air. It's way too high, but that's not the point. You can see the bridges, you can see the river, you can see downtown. It's absolutely spectacular. And so many of these ballparks, these new ones, are so good. Camden Yards started the whole process. That will always be my favorite of the new ballparks. But if you haven't been to Pittsburgh, you got to go.
Well, you heard it here. Pittsburgh, PNC Park. That's the place to go visit. And, I mean, it's a given that the usuals, the Fenway Park, the Wrigley Field, all of those are a given top 5 for most people. But PNC Park creeping its way up there. Now, Dad, Dad, we're on with Tim Kurkjian, ESPN baseball analyst and Sports Center contributor as well. But you're also a 3-time author. And I think a lot of people are wondering as to the title of your final book. And I know the story of it. I'm fascinated by Sacrifice Flies. This is your 3rd book in a series that started with America's Game. And this book was kind of worked through the Hall of Fame, correct? To get you, and through ESPN?
Yeah, the first one is an interactive book with the Hall of Fame where you open up a chapter on, let's say, baseball and World War II, and there are all sorts of little, interactive pieces you can take out of the book. I love doing it because it was in connection with the Hall of Fame, and I love the Hall of Fame. Second book is This Great Game or What? That came from your grandfather, by the way. He was the one that said that to me once as we were just sitting around watching a game. He just looked at me and said, Tim, is this a great game or what? After Pop, that's why I named that second book. And the third book is called I'm Fascinated by Sacrifice Flies. There's a long story to that. But one night on Baseball Tonight, I just blurted out after Carlos Lee hit his 11th sacrifice fly of the first half of the season. I said, I'm fascinated by sacrifice flies. I said that on TV, and Steve Berthew, the host of the show, stopped the show on live TV and goes, wait a minute, did you just say you're fascinated by sacrifice flies? So I said, yes. I try to explain why I am. And then I decided the next book I write, that's going to be the name of the book, because it really just kind of sums up how much I love the game. Is that the smallest thing, the most insignificant play you can think of, pretty much, a sacrifice fly. I find it fascinating. And I wrote an entire chapter on why sacrifice flies are fascinating. That's the reason I named it that, and it made the New York Times bestseller list. That made me pretty happy.
That is so cool. Now, for those, I've never written a book. And the thought of writing a book is probably the most daunting thing in the world. But I feel like a lot of people have sit around and said, you know what? I should write a book. We should write a book. Let's write a book. But how does one even get started in the thought process of writing a book? I mean, it just seems like an almost impossible task.
Well, you have to have great discipline to do it. But I got assigned the first book. Crown Books just called me and said, "We want you to write this book, and here's how we want you to write it." So I did. The second book, Is This a Great Game or What? Named by my father, but it was Pop, your grandfather, Jeff, that came to me once and said, "Tim, you got to haul these stories. You got to get them into one place. You got to find a way to get all your stories down somewhere." So he inspired me to do that. So I came home from the World Series one year. I'm not sure which one it was. It doesn't matter, 2004. And I just sat down and I said, the day I got home, I'm going to write a book and I'm going to finish it the day I go to spring training. So I've got about 3.5 months to write this book. All writers will tell you deadline is my best friend. All I have to do is know, when is this due? And the answer is, it's due the day I go to spring training, because I can't allow a book to get in the way of my daily job. Mm-hmm. So I said, all right, I've got all these stories. I'm going to organize them into some sort of form. And I can't see anything, Jeff. I mean, I can't read directions. I can't walk into somebody's house and tell you what it looks like, but I can see in my head how I can envision writing a book. So the first chapter was, this is the best game. So I used all my stories that just illuminate what a great game this is. And then the second chapter was about sports writers. Like, who are these people? Where do they come from? Like, how did I get my job? And then I wrote about managers and general managers and the players, of course, and ambidexterity. All my favorite chapters, all my favorite stories, I made a chapter out of it. And before you know it, I had 15 chapters. I filed on the day I went to spring training, and that book came out. So that was the key. You just have to sit down and write. And Jeff, for guys like me, I can't just sit at the computer and it just happens for me. Hey, I got it. Sometimes I have to go take a shower. Sometimes I have to go for a run. Sometimes I just have to do something else, get away, and then I get it. And I say, all right, I know how to do this. That's when you sit down and write. And I would write at 2:00 in the morning. I would write at 4:00 in the morning, whenever I was inspired to go, that's when I went.
That is so beautifully put, because I feel like when it comes to, your dad, my grandfather, he has had such an influence on your life, on my life, on the lives of so many in our family and around our family. And for him to just say, you got to get this down into one place, because legacy is something that I think is very important for people in a career like yours and like mine. And not in a way that is selfish. What is your legacy? But what will you leave? How will you leave this earth a better place than the way you arrived on it? And with that being said, you're the least selfish person in the world. You have no ego whatsoever, and that is something that I think I've learned a lot from you, and to keep myself grounded from your example. But with that being said, your legacy in baseball. How do you want to be seen 50 years down the road when people my age are your age, or in 37 years, and they're talking about Tim Kurkjian? How do you want to be known?
Well, I want to be known as a fair and honest journalist, number one. I want to be known as somebody who loved the game and tried to inform, educate, and entertain at times our best baseball fans. I also want to be known as the guy who, when somebody dies, I'm the one that sends him off and explains to our younger people who that person actually was. And Jeff, this all comes from my dad. This all comes from Pop. Baseball is the only language we spoke in my house growing up. My two brothers, your uncles, Andy and Matt, were great college players at Catholic University. Pop was a really good player himself. And this is all I thought about when I was a kid. And Pop taught us how to play the game. He taught us how to follow the game, but mostly he gave us a great feel for the game. This isn't something I got interested in after high school, Jeff. This has been with me my entire life. So when you talk about do what you love, I have loved this as far back as I can possibly remember. I mean, I was that dorky little kid who was, if he wasn't playing the game, He was playing APBA tabletop baseball. He was reading about baseball. He was watching everything he could. He was in the backyard throwing a zillion balls up against the house, catching fly balls and everything else. I could imitate half the hitters in the American League when I grew up. I mean, this is what we did at my house. And it used to drive poor Nana, your grandmother, crazy every once in a while that she used to say, Jeff, your grandfather, these kids need to do more than just play baseball. And Pop would say, no, they don't. They're fine. They need to go to school and get an education, and then we're going to play baseball. Uncle Matt and I took piano for like 3 months in the 5th grade. What a disaster that was. And finally, and probably the worst thing my father ever did, he went to my mother and said, look, these kids are ball players. They're not piano players. Take them out of piano. Let's go. And that was the worst thing we could have ever done because you can play the piano. I wish I could play the piano, but that's not the way it worked at our house growing up.
So you've told me quite a few times that obviously baseball is your passion, it is your career, but your number one job is being a dad and being a husband. You know, you have said that to me many times, and that is your most important job. And I think that that is commendable to say because there's unfortunately a lot of people out there that wouldn't rule that as their number one job. And you kind of lent to me being a piano player, my sister, your daughter, being a basketball player and artist, I might add, and great graphic designer. For you, you know, being a parent and having these two kids and saying to yourself, I have no idea what they're going to be interested in. You joke that you have no musical ability, but here I am being part of a music radio station and playing music and singing and performing myself. What was that like to see your two kids kind of take very artistic routes from somebody, and you claim not to be artistic, but writing is an artistic, it is an art, and it is a beautiful art at that. But what is it like for you to see your kids go in such different directions?
Well, it's been remarkable. I mean, again, I can't play anything. I have no musical ability, and you're great at it. Kelly is a brilliant artist who can do almost anything with a pen, a paintbrush, anything. And me, my mom used to hang my artwork on the inside of the refrigerator when I was growing up. That's how bad I was. But it goes back to mom. Mom is wildly creative. She can do all sorts of things. That's where Kelly gets it from. I was only in charge of the athletic part of this. And I think your athleticism mostly comes from me. Kelly's athleticism mostly comes from me. And I can't even begin to tell you how much I loved watching you kids play sports growing up. But I'll tell you this, Jeff, and I've told you this many times. There is nothing that made me happier than watching you up on stage crush a performance, whether it was The Odd Couple or Guys and Dolls. It was amazing. And I never, ever worried whether you were going to forget a line or miss a note or blow something on the piano. I never worried about that. You know why? Because I couldn't do that stuff. I always worried that you were going to strike out, which you did a few times, by the way, or threw the ball out of bounds, which you did a few times, and so did your sister. But those were the things I could relate to because I understood what it was like to strike out and turn the ball over at half court. So that made me nervous beyond words. But everything you kids did, I thought was great. And you know, Jeff, I never told you, Jeff, you have to be a baseball player. You have to be a basketball player. I never told you that. I would never tell you that. And I told you kids, do whatever you want to do. I'm here to help you.
What's one piece of advice you would give for maybe a high schooler or even a journalism student at a university who's looking to be the next Tim Kurkjian?
Well, it's the title of your podcast here, Jeff. Do what you love. Okay. The number one thing is I can do what I love right now because I found baseball and I chose baseball. If I were writing or commenting about politics or religion or soccer or hockey, I would stink at it because I don't know anything about that stuff. But I love baseball and I know about baseball, and that's why I can do this. So find something that you're passionate about, find something that you're good at, and then try to get into that. Along the way, of course, you're going to have to cover the other sports like I did, sometimes poorly. But mostly, you just have to show up and try every day in the end, Jeff. Find something you love and then just keep showing up. And if someone's going to show up and try to do his job better than you just make sure he does it. Once you get your foot in the door, you don't let anyone take your job away from you if you love it as much as, say, I do. And here I am, 64 years old, and I'm still thinking, I'm not letting anybody take my job because I can still do it. And that's why you have to keep showing up and trying every day.
Well, I think that's great advice, and I get asked that question all the time. And so for anybody listening, I think this is a great example of what we're doing here. We're on Zoom recording a podcast. It's also going to be a video podcast. It's that easy in order to start your own internet radio station, to start your own podcast, to start your own YouTube channel. And it's easier now than it was yesterday, than it was a year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years ago. So for those who are wondering how to do it, just do it. Just start by doing it, because, you got to show up in order to make it happen.
Right. Well, you say it's easy to start one of these things. It might be easy for you, Jeff. It certainly would not be easy for me. But again, that's kind of the point for any young person. If they ask you, can you do this? Whatever this is, the answer is yes, I can do that. I mean, you have to tell your employer that. You can't say, no, I'm not going to move to Dallas to take a job. Well, then you're not going to get the job. If they ask you, can you cover football? Of course, you're going to say, I can cover football. When I first started covering baseball full time, was a minor league team in Washington, D.C. while I was working at the Washington Star, Jeff. Huge daily newspaper. And I love baseball. All I wanted to do was cover it. So I went to our sports editor, Dave Smith. And I said, Dave, look, I'm volunteering to cover the minor league team here, the Alexandria Dukes. Will you let me do it? And Dave looked at me and he said, well, thank goodness you volunteered, because I couldn't find anyone who was interested in doing that. So that's where my career really started as a baseball writer, when I marched in there and volunteered to do something. And by the way, I got $25 a game. Okay. And I know this is 1979, 80. So maybe 29 bucks a game, 25 bucks a game was more important then, but no mileage, nothing else like that. But it was the greatest job ever. And I went to the ballpark like almost every night for 2 years covering minor league baseball. And I was doing a little major league stuff in the time. That's where my love for the game professionally actually started.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference, and that's a good point to say. Showing up at the ballpark every day, I think a lot of people, whether it is in sports or whatever, when they turn a hobby into a profession, it sometimes does not compute. It does not equal each other, because sometimes you want to keep a hobby and keep a profession, and keep these two separate, or else you'll start to lose the love. You haven't lost the love of baseball.
Right. But what I've done with basketball, Jeff, you know how much I love basketball. I love baseball, and then I love basketball. And then after that, there's a huge drop off. I've kept basketball as my hobby. Okay. I don't ever want to think about Larry Bird, who's one of my favorite players ever, and say, oh gosh, he yelled at me one night. I don't feel the same way about him. I don't ever want to look at Michael Jordan and think, oh, he wouldn't speak to me one day because he was mad at me. I just couldn't have that. I have kept basketball as my hobby. Baseball is my first love, and it's my job, and I've been able to combine the two, and it's been absolutely a tremendous ride, at least for me.
So before we let you go, this is my favorite question to ask anybody I interview. You're starting a podcast. It's called The Odd Couple. Tim Kurkjian and who? Now, the point of this podcast is to bring two worlds together that truly have no right being together. So two people who could not have more different lives. Who would you be interested in doing a podcast with?
Boy, that's a great question, Jeff. So I did something with that Michael Schur guy who did the Office, and he wrote Parks and Rec and many other things. So I guess he and I have something in common, in that we we are writers in our own way, but I cannot even fathom how he puts together a television show like that, even though I'm on a television show. So I would love to do a podcast with him because even though we're connected in a small way, I cannot understand how he does his job. And then I did a podcast with him, and he loves baseball. He really understands baseball.
Mm-hmm.
So I got a huge kick out of doing a podcast with a guy who deferred to me about all baseball things while I deferred to him about all things creative, because how good you got to be to do the office of Parks and Rec, among many other things. So that's one guy I would think about doing it with, because I think that would be a blast because he's brilliant and he's hilarious.
I think that's a great, great choice, and we look forward to seeing the release of that podcast soon. Thank you so much, Tim Kurkjian. You can follow him at Kurkjian_ESPN on his favorite app of all time, Twitter. And also, obviously, see him on ESPN, ESPN2. With the baseball season starting up, you'll be seeing him a lot more on your home television sets. Dad, Mr. Kurkjian, Tim Kurkjian, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jeff. Had a great time as always.